Hey everyone, welcome back to another explainer. Today, we are diving headfirst into a modern, super high-stakes clash, the intense tension between digital law enforcement and your personal privacy. We're going to look directly at the text of Canada's Bill C-22, also known as the Lawful Access Act, and the massive citizen backlash it has sparked in the form of parliamentary petition E-7416. So let me ask you something right off the bat. Who actually has the right to access your digital footprint? Think about your daily digital trail for a second. From the exact moment you wake up and check a weather app, to sending encrypted messages to your family, to logging into your bank, you are constantly generating data. And, as technology evolves, so do the laws governing who gets to look at that data and under what circumstances. That is the exact debate at the heart of today's explainer. Here is our quick roadmap for today. First, what is Bill C-22? Second, enter Petition E-7416. Third, metadata and broad definitions. Fourth, encryption and charter rights. And finally, the call to action.
All right, Section 1. What is Bill C-22?
To really wrap our heads around this bill, we first have to look at how it defines an electronic service provider. The text describes this as a person or entity providing an electronic service to persons in Canada or carrying out business activities there. It's a totally foundational definition because it establishes exactly who falls under the umbrella of this new legislation. Okay, but the absolutely crucial point here is what the bill actually requires these providers to do. The stated purpose is to modernize data gathering to assist law enforcement and agencies like CSIS. To do this, the bill allows the government to designate certain companies as core providers. These providers can then be required, by regulation or ministerial order, to develop interception capabilities, provide access to authorized persons, and retain metadata for up to a full year. All of this supposedly to benefit the administration of justice and national security. Which brings us to Section 2, enter Petition E-7416. 8,851. That is the exact number of validated signatures from citizens and residents all across Canada, literally from British Columbia to Newfoundland, who signed Petition E-7416. This isn't just a handful of complaints on some random message board. It's a formalized, sponsored petition officially presented to the House of Commons outlining some very severe reservations about the bill. Moving right along to Section 3, metadata and broad definitions. Remember that one-year retention period we just talked about? Well, the petition zeroes in on this big time. Bill C-22 authorizes the collection and retention of metadata on all Canadians for up to 1 year. But the absolute core of the citizens' grievance here is that this is done without any individual needing to be under suspicion or investigation. They argue this is basically a form of suspicionless bulk data retention applied to the general public. And this next part brilliantly illustrates why they care so much about metadata. I'm going to read this direct quote straight from the petition. Such metadata can reveal highly sensitive information, including patterns of movement, association, medical activity, religious participation, and political activity. See, while the bill doesn't require retaining the actual content of your messages, the petition argues that the metadata alone, the who, when, and where of your digital interactions, paints a deeply revealing, intimate picture of your private life. To really ground these abstract legal concepts in our everyday lives, the petition points out just how massive this net is. Because the definition of electronic service provider is so broad, petitioners argue it captures almost any online service you can think of. We're talking about encrypted messaging apps, VPNs used specifically for privacy, your email providers, your banking apps, and even your cloud storage. Basically, if you use the internet in Canada, the services you rely on could be forced to comply with these orders. Section 4. Encryption and charter rights. Let's look at the fascinating juxtaposition between the bill's stated protections and the petition's skepticism. On one hand, Bill C-22 explicitly states that providers are not required to comply if it means introducing a systemic vulnerability, meaning they don't have to break their own security in a way that risks everyone's data. Sounds good, right? Well, Petition E-7416 pushes back hard. They argue that the government retains broad regulatory power to completely redefine key terms, including systemic vulnerability and encryption, without ever having to return to Parliament for a vote. Because of this massive loophole, petitioners argue those stated privacy protections are, frankly, unreliable. The petitioners essentially argue that playing with encryption is like playing with fire. They claim that compelling providers to implement interception capabilities inherently weakens encrypted systems across the board. They warn this creates cybersecurity vulnerabilities that aren't just used by Canadian law enforcement, but actually become exploitable by criminals and hostile foreign actors. To really drive their point home, the petition specifically cites the 2024 Salt Typhoon attack on United States telecoms as a terrifying, real-world example of exactly what happens when network access points get compromised. All of this leads the petitioners to a pretty profound constitutional conclusion. They argue, and I'll quote them directly here, "Suspicionless, indiscriminate bulk metadata retention and interception capabilities raise serious concerns under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms." Specifically, they point to the protections against unreasonable search and seizure. So the petition is framing Bill C-22 not just as clunky tech policy, but as a fundamental violation of Canadian civil liberties. Which brings us to Section 5, the call to action. They lay out 3 very clear sequential demands to the government. First, they call upon the House of Commons to withdraw Bill C-22 entirely or vote against it at all stages. Second, if new legislation is ever drafted, they demand the removal of all suspicionless bulk metadata retention requirements. And third, they want the government to explicitly prohibit any future legislation from requiring the weakening or breaking of encryption. It is a definitive, uncompromising rejection of the bill's current framework. Which leaves us with this final, burning question to wrap up our explainer. How do we actually strike the right balance between modern law enforcement and the preservation of our digital privacy? On one hand, you have a bill drafted to give police and intelligence agencies the tools they say they desperately need in a digital age. On the other hand, you have thousands of citizens arguing that the cost, suspicious surveillance, and weakened cybersecurity is just way too high. The arguments we've explored today highlight exactly why this conversation is so incredibly vital for all of us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring these issues.